Buenos días, les damos la bienvenida a la segunda sesión del ciclo Lenguaje y Predicción. En esta ocasión nos acompaña la candidata a doctora Gabriela Garrido Rodríguez. Es licenciada en Psicología por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, maestra en Neurociencias Cognitivas por la Universidad Radboud en Nijmegen, en Holanda, y actualmente es candidata a doctora en psicolingüística por el Instituto Max Planck, también en Holanda. Realizó un postdoctorado en lenguas indígenas australianas en la Universidad de Melbourne, en Australia, y pertenece al Centro de Excelencia para las Dinámicas del Lenguaje del Consejo Australiano de Investigación. Está interesada en la relación entre el lenguaje, la cognición y la cultura, específicamente en los efectos de la variación tipológica en el procesamiento del lenguaje en lenguas indígenas. Estas lenguas han sido poco estudiadas en psicolingüística. La mayor parte de su trabajo de investigación se ha enfocado en el estudio de los movimientos oculares y el procesamiento del lenguaje. Ha investigado el procesamiento predictivo durante la comprensión del lenguaje en Tseltal, una lengua maya, y recientemente ha extendido esta línea de investigación para estudiar Tagalog, una lengua austronesia hablada en Filipinas. Asimismo, está interesada en investigar la producción del lenguaje. En esta línea de investigación se ha enfocado en cómo hablantes de lenguas que tienen un orden libre de palabras se planifican y producen oraciones. Este trabajo lo lleva a cabo en 2 lenguas indígenas australianas. En el 2023 le fue otorgado, junto con Evan Kidd y Rachel Nordlinger, el premio al mejor artículo en la categoría de lenguaje por la Sociedad Lingüística de América. Actualmente se encuentra como investigadora invitada en el Departamento de Desarrollo del Lenguaje en el Instituto Max Planck. Pues muchas gracias, doctora Garrido, por aceptar nuestra invitación. Es un placer para nosotros tenerla aquí. Bienvenida y la palabra es suya. Adelante.
Okay, gracias. Well, today I will talk about some experimental work I have carried out on anticipatory processing in Tseltal. Okay. Well, predictive processing has become an important theoretical framework in cognitive and neural sciences, with some researchers considering the human mind a predictive engine or a prediction machine, and humans even as anticipatory systems. In recent years, psycholinguistics has subscribed to the view that prediction is also central for language processing. Understanding spoken language requires transforming continuous acoustic streams into words. The listener has to retrieve these words from memory and then integrate them into an interpretation. So they have to go from sounds to meaning. This process is incremental and highly predictive. And in this talk, I will refer to prediction in language processing as the pre-activation of linguistic representations before incoming bottom-up input has had a chance to activate them. Well, eye movements have been used to investigate incrementality and anticipatory processing during sentence comprehension, and these studies use the visual world paradigm to evaluate online language processing and how it is mapped onto the visual world. In this experimental paradigm, participants see a visual display, like these ones, and hear an accompanying sentence or an instruction while their eye movements are recorded. Many of you will be familiar with Altman and Camide's seminal study. The authors contrasted selectionally restrictive verbs, such as eat, with less restrictive verbs, such as move, and found anticipatory eye movements at the cake when participants heard the boy will eat the cake. But when participants encountered the sentence the boy will move, all the items depicted were fixated because they were possible reference of the verb move. Well, Altman and Camide interpreted this pattern of looks as reflecting anticipatory processing of an upcoming grammatical object that satisfied the semantic restrictions of the verb. Researchers have found that several cues are used to anticipate upcoming information based on the target language under study. Overall, these studies show that listeners will use any meaningful cue that occurs in the sentence, in the target language of the speaker, to anticipate what comes next. However, most of these studies have focused on a small number of languages, mainly Indo-European, and it remains unknown how language comprehension is affected by the different grammatical features across languages. So psycholinguistics should be able to account for linguistic diversity. There are approximately 7,000 languages in the world that differ at every level of description. So in words of Bowerman, we have to move towards theories that do justice to this diversity. If anticipatory processing is a universal processing principle, we should find it in every language. So here, I use Tseltal, a verb initial Mayan language, to examine predictive processing during sentence comprehension. So why verb initial languages? Well, to date, we know very little about the online processing of these languages. Verb initial languages are rare. So VSO word ordering accounts for almost 7% of the languages in the world, while VOS, well, it's even less, 2% of the languages in the world have this linear ordering of constituents. So verb initial languages are very interesting because they offer the possibility to investigate what happens when comprehenders encounter event information up front at the start of the sentence. So I ask, in general, how is language comprehension affected when listeners encounter a sentence initial verb? Does information extracted at the verb is enough cue to drive anticipatory processes when no arguments have yet been available? And more importantly is, what type of information extracted from verbs drives anticipatory processing during sentence comprehension? To get at these questions, we used eye-tracking methodology and the visual world paradigm. The experimental setup was just the laptop, which has an arrow bar attached below the screen and that tracks eye movements when listeners are inspecting the visual display while listening to sentences over the headphones. So we brought the eye-tracking equipment to the field and we conducted the experiments in Majosic. Majosic is a Tseltal community in the southeast part of Mexico, in Chiapas, and it belongs to the municipality of Tenejapa. There are several Tseltal dialects, and the one I studied is, well, Tseltal from Tenejapa. So let me tell you a little bit about the language. Tseltal is a Mayan language spoken in Mexico by over 400,000 people. It is one of the most spoken indigenous languages in Mexico, together with Tzotzil. The language is head-marking and mildly polysynthetic, and as I mentioned before, it has a rare word order. So only about 2% of the languages in the world put the verb first and the subject last. Its most frequent constituent order is the verb, object, subject for transitive active sentences. However, the order of constituents is flexible and the grammar allows SVO word ordering when the initial argument is focused or topicalized. So this is an abstract version of a basic Tseltal transitive sentence. The verb root is in bold. So a sentence starts with an initial aspect marker followed by the verb. The verb root takes agreement markers that encode information about the grammatical roles of their subject and object arguments. And this follows a negative absolutive pattern. So transitivity is encoded morphologically on the verb, in contrast to other languages like English, Dutch, or German. So these properties might enable listeners to anticipate upcoming arguments before any of them have been mentioned. Today, I will only be able to present two studies. In study one, we investigated the use of verbal information to anticipate an upcoming grammatical object. And in study two, we went one step further and investigated both the types of information that could drive anticipatory processing in a verb initial language and how participants are assigned to thematic roles. In our first study, we asked whether Tseltal speakers use semantic information in the verb to anticipate the upcoming object, just like it has been studied in English or German. So in this study, we explored the processing consequences of a language with different word order. This study has already been published in Cognitive Science if you'd like to read it in detail, and all the materials are available online. So 51 native speakers of Tseltal participated in the study, and we followed Altman and Camire's study design. So we compared predictive verbs like eat to general verbs like move. This was within subject design. Participants saw a visual display like this one that depicted 4 items and heard a sentence with either a predictive verb, so only one item in the display fulfilled the semantic restrictions of the verb, or they heard a sentence with a general verb, where all items, including the target, were possible reference of the verb. In the sentential stimuli, we included an adverbial phrase between the verb and the object, to allow participants to fully process verbal information and allow the time it takes to execute a saccadic eye movement, approximately 200 milliseconds. So our time windows of analysis are shifted 200 milliseconds after the onset of target words. And we run separate analyses in 2 time windows. The first time window included the verb region and the adverb. So this is our anticipatory time window, and I will only focus on this window. We expected verb-mediated anticipatory eye movements during this window, so toward the target avocado-like items, to consider predictive processes in Tseltal. I used multi-level logistic regression models to analyze the data. So this is what we found. This is a time course of fixation proportions for target in orange and average distractors in gray. In the predictive condition, solid line versus control condition, the dotted line. On the x-axis, time in milliseconds is plotted, and on the y-axis, the proportion of fixations. So the graph shows that verbal semantic information was processed very fast. Fixations to the target started to increase after the predictive verb was heard, the orange solid lines, while distractors fixations decreased, the gray line, in the same time window. So let's focus on time window 1, our anticipatory window. We found a significant effect of verb type, indicating that fixations to the target were higher in the predictive verb condition compared to the control. And we also found a significant interaction between verb and time, suggesting that listeners were more likely to fixate the target when hearing a predictive verb, and as more verbal information became available over time. So our data provides cross-linguistic evidence to the body of work that shows that listeners use verbal semantic information to guide anticipatory eye movements to objects in the context of a visual display that fulfill the semantic restrictions of the verb. It also shows that in a language with different typological features, there is incremental interpretation and anticipation of upcoming reference at the earliest moment in time. So the first word heard is used to activate a representation of the event and its subject. Well, we think that the morphological form of verbs may provide additional cues in Tseltal, as they specify the transitivity of the sentences, signaling an upcoming object. Possibly this, in combination with the lexical information in the verb, supports rapid anticipation of reference. However, this study left some unresolved issues. So we used verbs that encouraged early attention to object reference. In addition, we did not depict subjects or agent reference. So it is an open question whether Tseltal listeners orient toward object reference, or if they would preferentially look at agents when both agent and patient are visually depicted. And that's what we investigated next. So what happens when we consider postverbal constituents? In this study, we asked, what types of information do listeners orient to for predictive processes? And which event role is anticipated when listeners encounter the verb? To answer these questions, we contrasted 2 types of sentential conditions. So consider a simple active transitive sentence. I showed you one in the first study. So just a reminder, the verb root takes agreement markers that encode information about the grammatical roles of their subject and object arguments. The linear order of argument is VOS, verb object subject, or VAP, verb agent verb patient agent. The subject is mentioned last. So what do listeners anticipate when hearing an active verb? Do they look more at the agent or the patient? And crucially, what is driving the anticipatory gaze behavior? We have three hypotheses. If predictions are driven by grammatical functions, listeners should look anticipatorily at the grammatical subject. However, if the linear word order is prioritized, listeners should look at the upcoming constituent. So they should predict the patient. But now, if thematic roles is the type of information that drives anticipatory processing, then we expect more anticipatory fixations toward the agent of the event. And it has been suggested in the literature that there is a universal agent bias in processing. So with active sentences alone, we can't fully differentiate between these possibilities. If listeners were to shift their gaze early to the agent, this would be compatible with the interpretation that they are prioritizing the agent thematic role, but also this is compatible with the interpretation that they are prioritizing the grammatical subject of the sentence. So we look at what listeners do when they hear passive sentences. Passive voice in Tseltal, at least one type of passive construction, is formed by the suffix ot plus a relational noun uun, which works as a by phrase, an oblique, and the subject. The suffix ot works as a prototypical passive. It expresses the event degrading the agent. Now, please note that the semantic roles are reversed in passive sentences. Now it is a patient argument that is linked with the subject. So we can tease apart the different possibilities. What you should remember from this slide is that active sentences in Tseltal have a VPA word ordering and passive sentences a VAP. So Tseltal allows us to test different hypotheses, which I mentioned before. If predictions are driven by semantic roles, we expect more looks to the agent after hearing the verb in both sentential conditions, regardless of its position in the sentence. If predictions are driven by grammatical functions, we expect more looks to the subject. In active sentences, it would be the agent, and in passive sentences, the grammatical subject is the patient. But if predictions are driven by the linear order of arguments, we expect more looks to the referent that follows the verb. In active sentences, it is the patient, and in passive sentences, it's the agent. We tested this hypothesis by manipulating verbal semantics and voice marking. So we compared verbs that are biased towards a prototypical agent and a prototypical patient. These are the predictive verbs, to non-predictive verbs, where everyone could be a good agent or a good patient of the event. And we manipulated voice marking, so predictive and non-predictive sentences were presented in active and passive voice. 92 native speakers of Tseltal participated in this study, and this was a 2x2 within subjects design with verb type and voice marking as factors, as I mentioned. So in this study, participants saw a visual display like this one that depicted 4 event characters and heard a verb initial sentence with a predictive verb. So only 2 arguments were plausible agent and patient roles. They heard this sentence in active and passive voice, or they could hear a sentence with a control verb. all post-verbal arguments were possible agents and patients of the verb. To assess the time course of fixations to the agent and patient characters, we use generalized additive mixed models. So we modeled fixations to the agent or patient. We ran separate models for agent and patient fixations. This was our dependent variable. As a function of smooth interactions for verb type or voice and time, and smooth interactions for time by participants and items, the random effects, allowing to fit a different smooth term for each participant and item. Again, I will only focus on time window 1, which is our anticipatory window. We conducted 2 types of analysis. The semantic analysis, where we contrasted predictive versus control verbs. So we ran separate models for active and passive sentences. And the second analysis was the voice marking analysis, which contrasted active and passive sentences that contained a predictive verb only. And this is what we found. So let's look first at the results for active sentences. These are the fixation plots for predictive left and control verbs on the right. On the x-axis, time in milliseconds from visual display preview is plotted. And on the y-axis, the proportion of fixations to the agent, red line, to the patient, the blue line, and to distractors, gray line. Overall, these plots show a different pattern of fixations when listeners encountered sentences with a predictive verb compared to those with a control verb. Looks to the patient character, the blue line, started to increase after the verb was presented, and these fixations continued to increase during both the adverbial and the patient regions. In addition, looks to the agent, red, started to increase during the adverbial region, where there was a steep drop in fixations toward the average distractors. And then fixations toward the agent increased again soon after the patient was heard. So, well, I said it, let's focus on time window 1, the yellow rectangle. The GAN models show that the odds of fixating the agent and the patient were significantly higher in sentences with a predictive verb in both the agent and patient models. So the results suggest that listeners used verbal information to anticipate both arguments in active sentences. So both agent and patient roles were activated at the verb, but with increased prioritization of the patient towards the end of the window. Okay, so the active verb is activating both event roles, but the participant that gets assigned a thematic role first is the patient. Now, in the control plot, you can see that fixations towards the agent and patient were directed, well, as a function of what participants were listening. So they followed the order of mention of the arguments. Turning to passive sentences, again, these are the fixation plots for predictive on the left and control verbs on the right. Here, looks to the agent increased soon after the verb was heard, where there was a drop in attention toward the average distractors. And fixations to the agent increased during the adverbial and bi-phrase regions and reached a peak while this referent was still unfolding in time. But interestingly, fixations to the patient started to increase after the bi-phrase was encountered. They continued to increase during the agent region and finally peaked when the patient was being heard. The GAN models show that there were significantly more looks toward the agent in the predictive verb condition compared to the control in the agent model. But in contrast, there were no significant effects of verb type and fixations to the patient in the patient model. So the results suggest that listeners used verbal information to anticipate the agent in passive sentences. Now let's turn to the voice marking results. Here we contrasted active and passive sentences with a predictive verb. During time window 1, there were fewer looks overall to the agent in active sentences compared to passives in the agent model. And this is compatible with the previous analysis where we found that in passive sentences, listeners are prioritizing anticipation of the agent. But the patient model shows that fixations to the patient increase over time in active sentences, while there were no significant effects of patient fixations in passives. So the results from the voice marking analysis suggest that listeners use verbal information to anticipate the patient in active sentences and the agent in passives. So let's return to our three hypotheses. Are predictions driven by grammatical functions? We found no pattern of results consistent with the hypothesis that the grammatical subject of the sentence is prioritized. Listeners did not anticipatorily look at the agent in active sentences or at the patient in passives, which were in subject position, respectively. Are predictions driven by the linear order of words? Yes. So results are broadly compatible with the interpretation that predictions are driven by word order. Listeners predicted the argument that followed the verb in each sentential condition. In passives, the oblique argument, which was the agent, and in actives, both arguments were predicted, but the patient was preferentially looked at the end of the window. Well, are predictions driven by a universal agent preference? Possibly. We can't fully rule out that agents are prioritized during time window 1. Our data is also compatible with an agent preference. So in passives, listeners predicted the agent. But it is interesting that listeners appear to prioritize the agent in active sentences, at least in the earliest stage. So this might be evidence for an agent bias, as proposed by several authors. In the previous slide, I wrote them. But alternatively, it could have to do with Tseltal's verbal morphology. Both the agent and patient arguments might be activated upon hearing the active verb, because both these arguments are cross-referenced on the verb. And moreover, the ergative person marker is overt and has certain pronominal properties. So the active verb is like a pronoun. It's as if listeners, in the context of the visual display, were hearing she, taught, he, or him. The verb encodes the whole argument structure frame. I would like to know what you think about these two possibilities. Whether there is an agent bias driving anticipatory processing in Tseltal, or if it has to do with the verb's morphology. So to conclude, the types of information that guide anticipatory processing in Tseltal are both the lexical semantics of the verb and the linear order of arguments, and this is new. So we add to the literature on anticipatory eye movements that, in addition to selectional restrictions, combinatory semantics and real-world plausibility, or other structural information and real-world knowledge, with this study, we add to that literature that semantic roles and word order are also targeted by anticipation processes. The time course fixation plots show that online processing of active and passive sentences is different, and it reflects the integration of both the structural information of the linguistic input and bottom-up visual information. Well, so our data is also compatible that anticipatory fixations could be influenced by local semantic priming, so local pre-activation of semantic representations, but it's also compatible with forward-directed prediction. I would also like to know what you think about that. What drives listeners' eye gaze? Well, this is the end. I would like to thank the participants in these studies, the language consultants, my supervisors and colleagues, and I would also thank you for your time. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por su presentación, por presentar sus estudios en Tseltal, con hablantes de Tseltal. Ahora tenemos tiempo para preguntas y comentarios, entonces esperamos las preguntas de las personas que nos están viendo por el canal de YouTube. Y en lo que llegan las preguntas, aprovecho para preguntarle sobre su experiencia, sobre todo cuáles son las diferencias entre realizar experimentos de esta índole de rastreo visual en el laboratorio, en el instituto, y realizar este tipo de estudios en el campo. ¿Cuáles son los retos, por ejemplo, ¿no? Porque me imagino que no es lo mismo.
No, no es lo mismo, pero nosotros nos dimos cuenta que es posible hacer este tipo de experimentos en el campo y bueno, vale la pena hacerlo, pero hay muchos retos. El primero es que, bueno, necesitamos electricidad y bueno, con esta población de Tseltal hubo varios retos porque no están acostumbrados a, bueno, a hacer experimentos. Entonces, cuando escuchaban las oraciones, como hablaban de diferentes cosas, las cosas que ellos veían, les parecían que estaban escuchando cosas que no estaban correctas, se cansaban, se iban del experimento o se quedaban dormidos. Los tseltales tienen, por ejemplo, tienen unas pestañas muy largas y muchas pestañas, y eso afectaba que el aparato pudiera ser que pudiera grabar los movimientos oculares. No podíamos calibrar los movimientos oculares. Pero en general, la gente después de haber participado en un experimento, les gustaba mucho la tarea y después querían participar en más experimentos. Lo consideraban también como un trabajo, que era un poco raro, pero tenían una buena disposición para los experimentos. Y los otros retos son, bueno, yo estuve viviendo en la comunidad, así que todo es diferente. Me parecía como que eso era un México diferente. Todas las costumbres, el ritmo de vida es diferente.
Muchas gracias por su respuesta. Tenemos algunas preguntas del chat de YouTube. La primera es, what is the effect of the extra cues the passive sentences give in the results of the predictive sentences?
Bueno, claro. A ver, el verbo pasivo, es posible que en el verbo pasivo las personas hayan anticipado únicamente la gente porque el verbo tiene más información sintáctica. A pesar de que nosotros únicamente analizamos la región del verbo con el sufijo ot, como en el visual display estaban todos los posibles, el posible agente, el posible paciente y los distractores, es posible que al escuchar el ot sabían que el agente iba a ser mencionado después del verbo Y bueno, antes de mencionar el agente, viene esta by phrase, ese sustantivo relacional, que también da más información sintáctica, que les dice que el argumento que viene es el agente. Aunque nosotros no analizamos ese sustantivo relacional en la región del verbo, con el adverbio, pero sí, es posible que el verbo en pasivo tenga más información sintáctica que permitiera, sí, bueno, movimientos oculares anticipatorios a la gente.
Muchas gracias. Y tenemos otra pregunta que probablemente está relacionada. In the experiments you showed us, is there any impact of syntactic prediction on semantics?
Ah, bueno, eso es lo que yo quería discutir también, y es lo que mencioné al final. A ver. Sí, a ver. Yo creo que los dos tipos de información tienen un impacto en el procesamiento anticipatorio, porque una es la parte semántica, sí anticiparon los dos roles en las oraciones activas y el agente en la pasiva. Pero como esta información también está relacionada con el orden de los constituyentes, bueno, esa es la parte sintáctica. Así que los dos tipos de información están afectando el procesamiento predictivo en Tseltal. Sí,
Muchas
pero
gracias.
creo que la historia es más complicada, pero sí, sí.
Otra pregunta en el chat. I have a question regarding the stimuli. Were
Sí.
the verbs and images displayed to participants frequent in use? I wonder if the stimuli were familiar to them due to the schooling experience they had.
Sí, esto fue, bueno, este fue el reto más grande, hablando de los retos sobre realizar experimentos en el campo. Hacer la estandarización del estímulo nos tomó 5 o 6 meses. Tuvimos que buscar, bueno, utilizamos cuestionarios, los cuestionarios que han utilizado, bueno, muchos investigadores, McRae, Ferretti, Cucona, en los que les preguntan a los participantes que hagan un rating de medidas de, perdón que lo voy a mezclar con inglés, de agenthood y patienthood. Y bueno, adaptar esos cuestionarios para la población en Tseltal fue muy difícil. No lo pudimos hacer. Bueno, lo tuvimos que hacer 2 veces. Primero preseleccionamos un número de verbos que nosotros pensamos que podían ser predictivos de un agente y de un paciente, y esos verbos los seleccionamos con informantes. Así que sí estaban en uso común. Pero después realizar estos cuestionarios, eso no funcionó solo con el cuestionario, así que tuvimos que hacer otro norming study de imágenes en las que presentamos, sí, posibles profesiones o personas realizando actividades, y eso lo pusimos junto con las preguntas del cuestionario para que ellos pudieran ver, bueno, a qué nos referíamos con un maestro o con un policía para ser un buen agente o un buen paciente. Sí, los verbos están en uso común y también las imágenes que mostramos. Y bueno, déjame hacer otro comentario con eso, los retos de trabajar en el campo. Por ejemplo, un verbo que utilizan en todos estos experimentos, que es arrestar, y que tiene un muy buen agente, que es un policía, con un muy buen paciente, que es un ladrón. Eso no funcionó en la población Tseltal, porque para ellos cualquier persona de la comunidad podía arrestar a cualquier otra persona de la comunidad, dado que, bueno, esos son los usos y costumbres que tienen ahí. Así que los verbos que muchos investigadores han utilizado como prototípicos de agentes y pacientes, eso no funcionó con la población Tseltal.
Hablando de de que los estímulos sean culturalmente apropiados, Ahora, hablando de su experiencia con este trabajo y con los hablantes de Tseltal, ¿existe alguna alternativa, en su opinión, al rastreo visual que fuera más culturalmente apropiada y nos pudiera proporcionar el mismo tipo de datos?
Bueno, para medidas fisiológicas no creo. Tendría que ser eye tracking o electrofisiología y habría que ver si los participantes quieren utilizar ese tipo de metodologías. Si no, tendrían que ser solamente cuestionarios o estudios de tiempos de reacción. Sí,
Muchas,
ya cualquier estudio psicológico que no incluya medidas fisiológicas.
muchas gracias. Y otra pregunta que tenemos en el chat es si las particularidades de cada lengua que se estudia se pueden capturar en estudios de predicción.
Hasta ahora sí. Digo, no hemos estudiado, hay una cantidad de lenguas con propiedades gramaticales muy interesantes y que no hemos estudiado porque tampoco están descritas. Así que sí, yo creo que claro que vamos a encontrar efectos diferentes dependiendo de las propiedades específicas de la lengua que se estudie. Y eso hace México un laboratorio súper interesante.
Pues muchas gracias, doctora, por su ponencia y por responder las preguntas. En el caso de que no haya más preguntas en el chat,
Ujú.
me gustaría agradecerle mucho por su disposición y por presentar hoy con nosotros sus trabajos, que son muy interesantes. Quisiera agradecer también a todos los que siguieron esta transmisión por el canal de YouTube y por las preguntas y comentarios. Y nos veremos la próxima semana en la siguiente sesión de este ciclo de lenguaje y predicción. Muchas gracias de nueva cuenta y hasta luego.
Gracias. Gracias por la invitación.